This week on Bedtime Stories, we examine one of the lesser known of America's unsolved crimes, a series of murders which took place during the early 1900s, perpetrated by an enigmatic and brutal killer, one who had become known over time as the Midnight Rider. There had been relatively few instances during the time he had served as county sheriff that Arthur Turner had made the decision to attend a crime scene in person. But having heard the background story regarding the incident his deputies had attended earlier that morning, it seemed prudent to do so under the circumstances. During the short ride from his office in Grand Forks to the premises in question, Turner privately hoped that the matter had escaped the interest of the local newspapers. But as he arrived to find one of his deputies ushering a reporter from the Bismarck Daily Tribune away from the boundaries of the address, he knew that he would have no such reprieve. Wearily acknowledging that if there was one, there would be others, the sheriff had assisted his subordinate in removing the troublesome journalist before making his way across to the nearby farmhouse. Once inside, he spoke briefly with the homeowner, a somewhat emotional young man named Vakulan, before being led out to the rear of the household. Waiting alongside the beginnings of a basement, which they had been digging out beneath the property, were two workmen, both of whom looked equally as haunted as their young employer. Turner listened solemnly as the pair described what they had encountered during the course of their work, and what lay beneath the tarpaulin they were standing next to. Then, with a wave of his hand, he had watched as the covering was pulled back to reveal the 5 skeletal bodies beneath it, all with their skulls completely smashed, beyond all hope of recognition. It would not be until well into the late 1800s that the United States government eventually settled on a means by which to resolve the thorny issue of the Dakota Territory. Having spent no small amount of time pondering over how best to dispose of the problem, it was decided to divide the sprawling region into 2 separate states. Such a decision naturally created a need to establish new towns and infrastructures, with would-be settlers incentivized by the reward of free tracts of land granted by the authorities. Amongst the many groups who decided to take up this offer was a small party from New York, which selected a site in the Red River Valley to found its new community. Christening their settlement Niagara in honor of the home county they had left behind, the inhabitants soon settled down into a quiet and unassuming lifestyle. That was, however, with the exception of one of their number, a 33-year-old bachelor by the name of Eugene Butler. From the moment he arrived, Butler's increasingly eccentric nature brought him into direct conflict with his fellow settlers. Electing to build his home well away from the rest of the town in the depths of the surrounding prairie, it seemed that trouble followed hot on his heels whenever he chose to venture into town. Butler was convinced that every unmarried young woman in the town was deeply intent on pursuing him romantically, and that every man he encountered bore him a hidden degree of ill will. He spoke openly of his belief that his life was constantly in danger, with the town's inhabitants all secretly eyeing his property and monies for their own selfish desires. When he did attend social functions, he would refuse to have his picture taken, saying that the photographer would somehow steal his soul into the device. As his mental health deteriorated, Butler's neighbours began to complain to the authorities that he was continually harassing them. Several reports were filed with the police to the effect that he was riding beyond the boundaries of his property at night, screaming wild obscenities and howling at the moon. When visited by deputies, the farmer did not deny his activities, instead justifying them by claiming that it was he who was the victim of harassment by those who had made the report. At great length, he described to the officers how unknown persons were creeping around his property in the dead of night, trying to gain entry to his home and steal his belongings. Untrusting of the police, or indeed any other person within the community, he had decided his only recourse was to resolve the issue himself. Conducting nocturnal patrols of his property on his horse, he would shout challenges to any intruder he believed he had caught sight of, lurking within the surrounding darkness. Eventually, in 1904, it was decided that Butler's antics had gone far enough, with the town leaders seeking engagement with his extended family in New York. After a brief period of consultation, he was subsequently removed from his home by force and then detained in the state mental facility in Jamestown. It was there that he would remain until his eventual death from natural causes in 1911. But the end of Eugene Butler would turn out to be only the beginning of his story. In the years that followed his almost unnoticed passing, Butler's estate was gradually divided up amongst his surviving relatives. This process would take no small amount of time, as his isolated and miserly lifestyle had accrued him a small fortune, both in land and government bonds he had purchased. Reports in local newspapers suggested that the overall value of Butler's assets at the time of his death would be the equivalent of $500,000 in modern value. It would not be until 1915 that his home was finally passed into the hands of a group of lawyers, before being placed on the property market for sale. In no time at all, it was promptly sold to a young family who were looking to settle down in the town, having just migrated to the local area from Wisconsin. Upon first moving into the farmstead with his wife and newborn baby, Leo Vakulin was more than satisfied with his new surroundings. Heralding from traditional farming stock, he immediately set about tilling the land around the property, commissioning workers to dig out a basement below the homestead. But hardly had this work begun when the tradesmen had immediately downed tools, calling for Vakulin to come and see what they had unearthed. There in the crawl space below the building were the skeletal remains of a naked human body, its skull completely pulverized and crushed beyond all recognition. Immediately alerting the authorities, the hapless homeowner had then been forced to witness a truly horrifying revelation, as over the coming days, several further bodies went on to be recovered. As word of the find began to spread throughout the surrounding area, journalists and crowds of onlookers were quick to attend, demanding clarity on what exactly had been discovered. During a hastily convened press conference, County Sheriff Arthur Turner provided what little detail he could, in an effort to suppress the many rumours that were beginning to circulate. In total, the remains of 6 unknown persons were discovered beneath the property, which were all believed to have been killed in an identical manner. The life of each victim had been cruelly and brutally ended with a fatal blow to the left side of their head from a sharp or pointed object. They had then been stripped of their clothing, with their skulls smashed to pieces, before being pushed through a trapdoor which had been built into the floor of the homestead. In the case of at least 2 of the deceased, arms and legs had apparently been broken in order to fit them through the aperture. 5 of the bodies had been found grouped quite closely together, a 6th half buried a short distance away, with nothing whatsoever to identify who they were. The working theory of the investigators was that the victims were farm workers or hired hands, who Butler had killed at various times over the years, likely as a result of his madness. It is probable that at the time of his speech, Sheriff Turner believed that however grisly the crime was, it would prove relatively easy to investigate. But as the months turned into years, the exact opposite would be true. The initial assertion by the police that the victims had been labourers or casual workers quickly began to fall apart. Examination of the bones suggested that only 2 of the deceased were adult males. One of the others most likely belonged to an adult female, with the remaining 3 being children of varying age. A new theory arose. With the corpse set aside from the others being one of the 2 men, it was now speculated that he alone may have been a labourer. The rest of the bodies most likely belonged to a family, which had been killed all at once. Inquiries by deputies would soon establish that no family matching the description of the remains had ever resided in or around the local area. There was also no suggestion that Butler had ever allowed lodgers to stay at the premises, prompting speculation that the victims may have been visiting members from his own extended family. But liaison with the police department in New York revealed that this was not the case, with Butler's surviving relatives adamant that nobody from the family had ever disappeared. The only person to ever answer the public appeal for help in identifying the deceased was a businessman from Minnesota named Leo Urbanski. In a letter to the state attorney, he inquired if it was possible that his missing brother may be the dead man buried alongside the family. John Urbanski had last written to him in late 1902, stating that he was passing through the Niagara area, but would be staying on a while to work on the farm of a local bachelor. With the suggestion that the missing Urbanski brother and the lone body which had been recovered both possessed crooked noses, it was hoped that this aspect of the mystery would be solved. However, it proved inconclusive. During the 1980s, the emergence of DNA analysis provided a means of identifying human remains, and the authorities moved to apply this technique to the still unsolved case. But when members of the team allocated to carry out the inquiry looked into the matter, they discovered that the remains of the victims were nowhere to be found. It transpired that there had been lengthy periods of time during the original investigation where the bodies had been left unguarded by Sheriff Turner and his deputies. This had resulted in local residents being able to trespass on the farm and remove pieces of the bodies from the grounds as grisly souvenirs. In addition to this, the samples taken by the police department had either been lost or disposed of over the years, leaving absolutely nothing to compare the familial DNA sample to. With the passage of time that has elapsed since the incident, it now seems apparent that the identities of the deceased will forever remain a mystery. But as frustrating as this fact is, it has not deterred investigators and commentators from continuing to examine the case in subsequent years. Analysis of the scene at the time would suggest that the murderer could only have been Butler himself, and no one else. It was he who had personally constructed the property where the bodies were discovered, and added modifications such as the trapdoor where they had been disposed of. There is no suggestion that any other person had resided with Butler at the address, and the erratic behaviour he displayed seems to offset the lack of any obvious motive for the crime. Interviews with doctors at the North Dakota State Hospital suggested that Eugene Butler had been something of a model patient. Finally separated from his fortune, his paranoia and suspicion had faded away, with no signs of aggression displayed towards the medical staff or those who visited him. But there remained a strong conviction that all women were attracted to him, with one female nurse having to be moved to avoid the patient's aggressive and unwanted advances. In an interview at the time the remains were discovered, Dr. A.W. Guest stated that despite his many ramblings, Butler had never once spoken of harming or killing any person. It is entirely possible that he had killed the people found at his home, suspecting them of trying to steal his fortune, and had then completely forgotten he had done so as his mental state began to recover. It was not uncommon, however, for Butler to describe to his doctors that he had heard sinister voices telling him what to do. On occasion, he would carry out strange acts in front of the staff, later claiming he had no recollection of doing so, as if some unseen force had temporarily taken control of his body. This raises the prospect that had he lived to be accused of the crimes, Butler may well have claimed to have been suffering from some form of personality disorder, or even demonic possession. In truth, the only person who actually knew what took place at the remote farmhouse on the outskirts of Niagara died well before his crimes were discovered. The house that Eugene Butler constructed and then adapted to serve his misdeeds was demolished many years later. An industrial storage unit now stands on the site, belonging to a local family which owns the land. Repeated public appeals for local residents to search their basements and attics for the bones that were stolen from the crime scene have yielded no positive results, all of which seems to indicate that the victims of the Midnight Rider will remain unidentified. The manner in which they came into contact with their killer is as mysterious as the reasons for which their lives were so brutally ended. May their souls rest in peace.
Hello.